Here we go. All right. So here is a little recap. This looks like a slide we saw yesterday or the last time we met. So basically this just gives you a timetable of how the allocation and the proposals for the American Rescue Plan Act funding has been moving. Now, remember, this is a $5.8 billion amount of money that was allocated to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts through the Federal American Rescue Plan Act. And so I tried to chart here a little bit how the money for arts and culture has sort of moved, right? So we have here with Governor Baker's announcement, excuse me, you have 100 million for Mott to take on cultural and tourism assets. Then the House proposes 125 million for the Mass Cultural Council for cultural assets. Then the Senate proposes 75 million for the Mass Cultural Council for cultural assets. Conference committee gets to work on Tuesday night, on Tuesday, the conference committee released their version and they included a line item for 135 million for cultural assets. And we expect Baker to sign this bill almost, if rumors are true, almost immediately after it lands on his desk later today. The Senate is voting during session today on the bill. So 135 million, that feels kind of great, not so fast. So here, just really quickly, here's what we're going to focus today our conversation. So there's first line item, which is 1599-2043. In the chat, you should see links to all of the versions of these bills if you want to unpack. But this is the reserve for cultural and tourism assets, and it's totaled at 135 million. There's another line item, which is 7002-1530, which is for capital improvements, cultural and tourism related projects, programs, right? Which is at 13.6 million. All right, but let's dig in a little bit on that first line item. So here's how it breaks down. There is almost more than half is allocated for earmarks. So this dark blue, this 44%, is the money that is included in this line item that will be available for the Mass Cultural Council to allocate through an equitable grant program. And that equals about $61 million or $60 million, okay? The others are tied up in earmarks, and you can see that only 10% of the earmarks are actually going to arts and tourism projects. So you can see that 60 million, right? So again, I just want to clock for us, right? Throughout this process, there have been a lot of earmarks for arts and culture. So in the House version, there were earmarks for arts and cultural projects, but there was a distinct $125 million amount for grants to be distributed through the Mass Cultural Council. In the Senate version, again, there were absolutely earmarks, but there was a distinct amount of 75 million that the Mass Cultural Council would distribute for arts and culture. In the final ARPA bill, there is only 60 million to be distributed through an equitable grant program for arts and culture, okay? So that doesn't feel great. And I'm gonna level with you, I'm gonna be honest. I had a rough day yesterday as I was unpacking this, right? Because we know the need, we've clocked the need, right? We've all participated in surveys. We've recommended, we've advocated for much higher numbers. And for this to be the number can feel really disappointing. And let's acknowledge that, okay? And the other piece is that there's already reports that say that there's 135 million for arts and culture, and that's not true, right? So let's break down some of those a little bit more in terms of that line item. So here is all the money and how it's going to work. So here's the 44% that's going for grants. Here's the 10% that goes for earmarks that are really about arts and cultural projects. And then here is the amount that's for other projects that really aren't arts and cultural focused. And you will see that 37% of that money is $50 million for the MBTA, specifically a project for infrastructure related to Norfolk County stations, okay? I want to just point out here that if you read through the entire conference committee report, you will see throughout all of the line items that there are many moments where there are different earmarks tucked in that don't necessarily correlate with the defined purpose of that line item. So good news, we haven't been signaled out, but bad news, this is sort of where it falls, okay? I want to talk a little bit about earmarks now, because I think they're an important part of this conversation. So you have $13.6 million of earmarks for cultural use. I've sort of pulled out the non-cultural use in this 135 million. Whoops. And I'm stealing my own thunder here. And then in the second line item, you have about 12.7 million that are earmarks. So let's talk about earmarks for a second. Earmarks do not require a grant panel process. They do not require the applicant or the recipient to talk at all about use. They are absolutely within a legislator's right, and it is part of the way that our government works, right? They are allowed to advocate for earmarks for things in their district, but they are not 100% not an equitable way to distribute money in our sector. And I'll show you one way to think about that now, which is I went through and I did an analysis of within both line items, when you're looking at arts and cultural earmarks, forgive the typos, that the earmarks, those earmarks that had a focus or on BIPOC communities, organizations that are led or mission statement is about serving BIPOC communities, about 5% or less than 5% ends up being earmarks for those groups. So that's about $500,000, right? So there are many other lenses to look at to talk about diversity and equity around earmarks, but this is a pretty startling accounting, right, of how earmarks shift who is able to receive resource, okay? So we're gonna just talk about some takeaways, right? As disappointed as I was yesterday, I have gone through my stages of grief, and I know that 60 million will do a lot of good, right? The Mass Cultural Council is uniquely positioned to make sure that there are grant processes and a grant program that I imagine they will design with the cooperation and coordination of the field that will meet the need, right? But we all know that's not enough. We know that our losses have over at least just the first year of the pandemic were clocked at about $600 million. And that's just the first year. We know that every time a variant shows up, audience attitudes towards going back to indoor arts and cultural spaces or public spaces in general declines, okay? And we know that there are individual creative workers and individual artists that are still trying to figure out how to recover from this. So we are a long way from done in our advocacy. We also know that earmarks are in no way equitable. And I think, and this is a pretty bold statement for an advocacy organization to say, there's probably need for an internal community conversation about how we are going to treat earmarks within our sector and how we're going to think about making sure that these dollars are being equitably distributed, right? And finally, arts and cultural advocacy is an ongoing effort. We all, you on this call, me on this call, we have been at this well before COVID started, and we're going to continue to go forward even after it. So, so those are like my big takeaways. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and talk about a couple of other takeaways, which is, I think, a question that I got from a lot of people yesterday is, well, what do we do? How do we handle this? And the fact of the matter is that basically this bill is done, right? The Senate's going to vote on it. It was a very hard negotiated bill, right? Like the legislature certainly didn't want to do this in informal session. They want to get this done, and Baker wants to get this bill signed. So there is not an amendment that we can file to try to get that number up within the next 12 hours. Or sorry, excuse me, I think it's going to be like 4 hours, right? The other thing we know is that there is a state budget process that will start in January. And we were able to successfully secure $20 million for the Mass Cultural Council, which is the largest annual state appropriation for arts and culture. And so we're going to keep working on that. We also know that this is not the entirety of the ARPA money. And we're going to be talking with lawmakers. We're going to be talking with you all in the field about how we're going to make sure that they know that we will be coming back, that we will be asking and urging them to continue to prioritize a sector that has been consistently impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We are going to start working on an action alert that we will share and circulate on Monday, which will be an opportunity for you to just check in with your legislators, let them know that $60 million is meaningful, and it's the start. We are not done, okay? So that is sort of where I am. I am still processing this in real time. I think you have grown to know that Mass Creative provides you with honest feedback and analysis of public policy. And so that's what we're doing this morning. So again, I want to reiterate, $60 million is not nothing. And that is a good start. But we are not done. And so with that, I am going to open up the chat. Yeah, okay, so Ron asked a really interesting question. What lessons have been learned regarding advocacy and how it has been and how it should be implemented? I think there's a takeaway here that's pretty important, and I want to just like lift this up. So in the fact that Baker's original proposal was for the Massachusetts Office of Tourism and Travel to take $100 million and create a marketing campaign and maybe shift some of that money into the Cultural Facilities Fund. And the fact that throughout this process that the money within the ARPA bill has shifted to include $60 million for arts and cultural actual grant recovery is a pretty interesting mile marker about our united advocacy, right? Like that, it started out not being about grants for recovery, relief, or innovation for any cultural organizations or any individual artists, okay? And it's not that anymore. The other piece is that the fact that we were baked into the House original proposal and the Senate original proposal does mean something. That wouldn't have happened without consistent, united advocacy messaging that you and I have all taken a part in to make sure that our legislators and decision makers know that we are paying attention and that this is something that we value. And I'm seeing Carrie ask a Schoolhouse Rocks question. How the heck does the MBTA funding get included in the arts funding? If you go through that bill, you will see the MBTA shows up in a lot of different allocation lines. It is not, they are tucking things in where they need to tuck things in. And, you know, none of us were in the negotiation room. And they worked really hard and into the late night. And I want to give credit to our lawmakers who are thinking about these things, but that is not the only place that it has been tucked. And that happens. And then Annis asked, with the MBTA funding tucked into the AC line, do you see opportunities? Yeah, is for more intentional integration of arts and culture into station improvement projects? So that was my question yesterday, actually, Anna. So I was like, well, great. If they get $50 million, I'm super excited for public art on the T, right? That's not the way earmarks work. Earmarks work where the MBTA will take that money and they will allocate it how they want to, okay? William brings up a good point. Yes, we are not in competition with Mott. But the Mass Creative is a state arts advocacy agency around arts and culture, specifically around the individual creative workers and the cultural organizations that make up our sector. And so our focus has almost always been about how do we get more money to those organizations so that they can, and those individuals so that they can do their work. There should be more money for tourism, and there are many tourism advocacy organizations that are working on that. But it is not an either or, but for us, our focus is really looking at recovery, relief, and stabilization dollars. Don is saying he's speaking later today with our state rep about planning to be honest about the disappointment I'm feeling. Yeah, I think let's remember this, right? We are always going to be strategic. We're always going to be appropriate, and we're going to show etiquette, but we can be disappointed when we're disappointed. But I want to think about, what do we want that disappointment feeling and message to lead to? And I think it's this: we are going to come back. We're going to continue to talk with you about this. And yeah, I think you can absolutely bring up the inequity of earmarks. I want to remind you that legislators feel very, very strongly about the fact that they have the ability to provide earmarks for things that are important in their districts. And we do not at all want to stop legislators from exercising their constitutional right. We do want to think about the equity question. And we'll be doing another deep dive to take a look at geographically how those earmarks lay out, because that's another piece of this conversation, right? Looking at which parts of our Commonwealth are receiving additional dollars that don't go through consideration about allocation and need. Okay, I'm trying to, let's see, are artists and individual artists, Maureen? Yes, they are. So that was right in the Senate version. We were like, whoa, buddy, we are missing artists in this conversation. So if you read the line item, that first one, that, that 1599-2043, it says cultural organizations and artists. So yes, that is very important. Have I heard anything about prioritization of arts and culture sector in ARPA number 2? James, I sort of, that was in my head. I was like, great, well, let's start talking about ARPA number 2. And I was counseled that maybe giving like 10 minutes before I asked that question to lawmakers might be helpful. I was in a, in conversations, there's always, some lawmakers are saying like, yeah, there's more money out there, there's more opportunity to advocate, but no one is saying like, yes, that's going to be our top priority. For Mass Creative, that certainly will be. Is it beneficial to frame, so Craig asks, frame the 60 million as a 10% down payment on the identified 600 million impact? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think the other thing you say is might help correct the 135 million figure. So here's what Mass Creative is going to do. When we talk about funding for the arts that's included in this bill, we're going to be using the $60 million figure. We will not be saying that there is 135 million included for arts and culture in this spending plan, because and then if you include those earmarks, I think we get a little north of $80 million, right? But if we're just talking about actual grant assistance and recovery and stabilization efforts for the sector, that's 60 million, and that's how we're going to be talking about it. Can I talk about the reaction of Senator Kennedy and Chair Kennedy and Chair Faiola? This is their leadership also. Yeah, so I managed to find myself in a conversation with Speaker Mariano, where at the time I thanked him for the House's inclusion of 125 million for arts and cultural recovery. And he was very clear to say that Chair Faiola was instrumental in raising the specifics of the needs of our sector and not stopping talking about it. Basically, she was in my office all the time talking about this. So I want us to acknowledge that in Chair Faiola and in Chair Kennedy, who filed the original recovery bill, we have two people who don't take this lightly and have been working their political connections and relationships and strategy to bring these issues to the forefront. I think that they are realistic, right? Again, this bill went through a lot of different iterations, and they are highlighting the fact that that it was baked in. But that's, as far as reactions, that's what I can share. And I do want to also just point out, right, like dropping a note of thanks and encouraging our champions in the legislature is just as important as communicating when we are disappointed, because our friends in the legislature need to know that we support them. Then Yoshi says, +1 Craig. Oh yes, Craig gets the communication strategy award for the morning. So yes, we all agree with that. And G also puts some links, includes the links, so you can see all of those links. So those are all the questions I see in the chat. If folks want to not use the chat to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and we can chat.
Hey, Emily, it's Nick.
Hey, Nick.
I just want to thank you for your efforts on behalf of the field. It's not an easy thing to wend your way through this, and I share your disappointment. But I did want to focus on the glasses half full side of the equation. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, even at 60, that's triple the highest budget that the Mass Cultural Council has ever had for an annual budget. I mean, it would be interesting going forward on a 2-track path if, I mean, let's just think of it simplistically. If the Mass Cultural Council didn't spend a lot of time cooking up a new grant program and just doubled its grants to everybody who's on the roster now, and did that for the next 3 years while we collectively work to get the actual annual budget of MCC doubled to 40. And if we could achieve that, it would be an enormous step forward on an ongoing basis. So there, in addition to trying to carve out more ARPA money, more recovery money, if we saw this as an opportunity to put us on a glide path from 20 for MCC to 40 a year, that would be a major accomplishment.
I 100% agree with you. And I think, right, like it's, don't get angry, get to work. I'm bastard, or excuse me, I'm totally misparaphrasing a sentence or a phrase, but yeah, I think that's it, right? Like the fact, again, to lead to this glass half full, the fact that these things were baked in is a meaningful indicator of our shared advocacy efforts. That doesn't happen if all of us on this call aren't reaching out to our lawmakers, aren't talking to our audiences and members and board members and saying, this is a real thing, right? Making sure the general public realizes our value, right? So yes, we have made some real important moments forward, right? So now what are we going to do? And I think this piece, Nick, that you bring up about how are we going to talk about a real significant public investment from the state in arts and culture and the sector and the creative workers that make up our sector is absolutely where my head is right now. And so, yeah, that strategic piece about how the Mass Cultural Council chooses to use this money, I think this is also important to note, right? This is not $60 million to just funnel into existing programs. The Mass Cultural Council is literally charged in the legislation to create and design new grant programs. There are guardrails that have been put into that legislation about things that they are going to have to consider when they are distributing that money. And I think if we know our Mass Cultural Council, right, our state arts agency, and we know the sort of trend of the new executive leadership there, we can expect an opportunity to connect with the state arts agency and the Mass Cultural Council around the need and the use of this funding. So that's going to be another piece of this, right? About how we sort of say, okay, This money is going to help recover, stabilize, and move us in the next sector. We're going to continue to work for that, increasing the allocation, the annual allocation. And I'm just going to note something in the chat. Lawmakers are going to say that they included more than $200 million for arts and culture in this ARPA bill. They include, and they didn't, first of all. And secondly, that money did not go through a process where arts and cultural organizations that maybe didn't know about earmark processes, do not have the relationships with their lawmakers, do not have lawmakers who are in positions to be able to really push, or were lawmakers who had to make difficult choices about which earmarks they were going to prioritize, right? That's an inequitable system. And we have worked so hard as a sector to really push to think about united advocacy support, or excuse me, united messaging for more dollars for equitable distribution. And for me, that's one of the other takeaways about this, is how are we going to work to increase the pot and to think carefully about how that money responds to the sector, to historic underinvestments, and to a Commonwealth that has many regions that require access to arts and culture, right? So yes, so Johanna asked a question, are there parameters and constraints on how the ARPA money can be used? Yeah, so originally, you know, the federal law does have specifics, right? Like they said to the states, you can't use this to replenish your rainy day funds, right? And the thing that's going to be interesting about this is because it's federal money, there's going to probably be a much more stringent reporting process for this. And that the state will have to make to the feds, right? And so there's architecture within the whole proposal itself about how that money gets spent and the uses, and then within these line items, there's clarity that syncs up with the eligible uses that ARPA lays out. Okay. Maureen asks, who was on the conference committee? So the conference committee included the two chairs of Ways and Means, Chair Michaelwitz of the North End of Boston, and Chair Rodericks of the South Shore, Fall River, and Westport District. It also included Rep. Dan Hunt, who was the chair of, or is the chair of the Federal Stimulus and Census Oversight Committee, and oh, this is embarrassing. On the Senate side, we have this on our website. The other member was
Friedman and O'Connor.
Thank you, Senator Friedman. Thank you. Thank you, James. And then there were ranking minority members. So Patrick O'Connor on the Senate side, and then I'm blanking on the ranking minority member on that.
Smola.
Thank you, Smola. Thank you. It takes a village, friends. Thank you. So again, you know, they are charged with listening to their colleagues, right? And so it's not about, I want to be real clear here. We're not going to write angry hate mail to those conference committee members. We don't write hate mail to begin with, so let's start with that. But this is, you know, this is the end result of a very long negotiation process where there were many voices and many interests in this conversation. And I just also want to put on the table, and this is 100% personal here, I don't think that we should, so let me phrase that, let me put it into the positive. I think the state should fund transportation in Massachusetts, right? I don't think that that's a problem. I just think there should be more funding for arts and culture, right? So let us also think about, it's not about saying, well, those guys got more. It's about saying, here's what, as Craig said, this is a down payment. So let's continue to talk about how we invest in the recovery, stabilization, and future of our cultural community. Right, so the MCC, no, the Mass Cultural Council has not provided a timetable or a timeline for the program, especially since it hasn't been signed into law, right? So can't really, you know, a state agency that publishes what their timetable is before the bill is signed into law is going to look that's not going to work. The other piece is that, I think in terms of wanting to be deliberative in this process, it will take some time, right, to design a grant program. Any of us on this call who've been involved with the design and execution of a grant program know that's the case. So they haven't provided a timetable. I think we also know that we have a state arts agency that is very receptive and responsive. So I would expect that to come as appropriate. All right. Other questions, other thoughts? All right. So we are going to publish a sort of a deeper dive on our website. We're going to try to, that is based on all open access information that you all can take a look at too. But we will continue to work on making sure that you can understand this legislation in a way that's useful. And then when you are talking with lawmakers, right, like we don't just talk to lawmakers when we need something, we talk to lawmakers all the time, right? We share with them the updates about what's happening with us. And we also tell them we're honest with them, right? So we'll put out an action alert that will be an opportunity to connect with your lawmakers. And this is our continued work. Yoshi, I see you have your hand raised.
So I just wanted to report that, the Network for Arts Administrators of Color of Arts Boston had a really wonderful panel that she was part of talking about advocacy. And one of the things that came out of that was partly came from Michael Bobbitt, but from other members, including some of the very, the youngest mentees in the program, because it's part of the mentorship sponsorship program that we're doing. And one of the ideas that came out was the idea of maybe doing some kind of advocacy 101 series to prepare for the next ARPA bill. Because when we were talking to some of the emerging arts administrators, it became clear that, right, that they need tools and which obviously Mass Creative produces, but it would be really beneficial for them to sort of like get education and bring more and more people on. And as part of that, I think claim your wins, because there are some major wins in this, as disappointing as it is. But yes, we went down to 10% of our need, but we started from zero, right? So claim the wins, claim the individual artists that got taken care of, and show people that the impact of effective advocacy and of strategic effective advocacy. Because if you all hadn't organized the commissions, et cetera, to establish those figures, the 575, 585, 600 million in advance, we wouldn't have had a prayer. So, that's it. Thank you.
Yoshi, thank you. And yes, I love to claim a win. And I also love to be honest, right? And we're all having a lot of emotions. And one of them was, I did have this moment a couple of days ago where I was like, I can't even believe I'm disappointed at 60 million, considering my peers in other states, right, who are getting laughed out of rooms when they're talking about arts and cultural recovery. But we will continue on, right? Yoshi, I love the point you're bringing up about more advocacy trainings. Mass Creative and G, who is on this call, say hi, G. Or maybe hello. We are working on providing more sort of one-off trainings, and then actually working on more of a specific series that helps build regional and local arts organizing efforts. I think one of the things that's been, and if I may, been really inspiring to me over the last year and a half is how many of you show up to these calls, how many of you email me to give me updates about what's happening with your legislators or what's happening in your districts, or are telling me about wins that you're having. And that means that, Mass Creative is a small but mighty team, but we are by no means the end all be all. It is all of us. We do this together. And when we unite in advocacy, we can make change happen. So we will be continuing to work on that. And Yoshi, I'd love to talk with you offline about ways that we can do that through a lens of empowering emerging arts leaders and thinking about BIPOC leaders in particular, or artists or arts administrators of color. Robert, you've just written Emily, comma. Did you have more you wanted to share, or?
I was trying to send a chat before, and thank
Oh.
you for this great look at what is actually there.
Mhm.
And I agree with all of it,
Okay.
60 is not what is
Not nothing.
needed, but it's a good start.
That might be my
And
campaign
Nick,
slogan.
your idea of how of using this as a stepping stone to advocate to get the Mass Council from 20 to 40, and that kind of thinking and moving forward is right on the head, nail on the head on the nail. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. I know exactly what you mean. The only other thing I would add to that, Emily, is that, which you already know, is that we're focused so like a laser on the state and state legislators, but at the end of the day, they're spending federal money. It's the federal money that's had this
Impact.
quantum impact. I was explaining to someone the other day that when you think of the National Endowment for the Arts, its budget for the whole country is $162 million, and that's at a high water mark. And only 40% of that gets distributed to the various state arts agencies. And when you think of the last 18 months, how much money has come to arts organizations through the Small Business Administration for payroll protection or shuttered venue, if you just isolate the arts organizations, it's $30 billion in 18 months. And I was saying to someone, in order for the NEA to have the same kind of impact on our sector at their current budget, it would take 175 years. But the federal government did it in a little over 1 year. So the arts is experiencing something that I think social services in general are beginning to see, and the public is beginning to see. Not so much with regard to the state, which is under more budget constraints than the federal government is, but the federal government has the capacity to do so much more. And to the extent that we can not forget that part of our efforts should be to try to get them to continue, or maybe have a continuing program instead of a just shuttered venue operating.
Yeah.
How about a venue operating program?
And Nick, it is not lost on me that your organization is in the district, the congressional district of the House
Ricky
Chair
Neal.
of Ways and Means,
Yeah.
right? And the chair of rules is Congressman McGovern.
Right.
Literally, the assistant speaker is Congresswoman Catherine Clark. There is power in our congressional delegation, and your point about continuing to update and make relationships with those members of Congress is very important. I also want to point out another piece, right? So Mass Creative, we are statewide, and we do spend a fair amount of time on that state level, but we also are looking at all of the cities and towns and municipalities, right? And every single municipality in Massachusetts also received American Rescue Plan money, and they have not all made their plans. And we've talked about in previous calls, we have resources on our website, which about how you can talk to your local elected decision makers about using that money for arts and cultural recovery, right? If you think about it, if we've got straight direct federal dollars of SVOG and Small Business Administration, PPP loans, if we have state allocated ARPA funds and we have local city and town ARPA funds, that paints a much stronger picture of support. But that's not going to happen unless we're all focused on that as well. So if you have, I know I have some questions in my inbox already about local advocacy, but if you have questions about that or wins you'd like to share with us that we can amplify out, do let us know. G and I and Jazz are all here working and trying to, frankly, sometimes work as the switchboard operator of connecting people and connecting ideas. I want to thank you all for your hard work. I want to thank you all for being part of this community. We have gone well over time, but I also want to appreciate you for the optimism and continued work together. We're going to do this. And we're not going to stop. This is a marathon. And this is where I will remind you that Mass Creative has launched its All In campaign. This is our work to try to increase the number of individual donors and organizations who are members of Mass Creative. We've set an ambitious goal of $10,000. I was going to say $2 million. And I was like, that is too ambitious, but $10,000 by the end of the year of individual donations. And we are looking to increase the number of organizations who are saying we're all in. So this is our all in campaign. Mass Creative is all in for arts and cultural recovery and advocacy. And we're looking for you to count yourself amongst that number too. So thank you all. Frankly, this is the holiday season. The legislature is doing some weird things. We'll see if we have a call in 2 weeks. But in the meantime, our inboxes are always open. Our phone lines are always open as well. So if you have questions, we are here and we are ready to collaborate and continue to move forward. So thank you all. Have wonderful weekends. I will be outside cutting down a Christmas tree. So hope you have some good times too.